The light in India was a physical blow. It wasn't the gentle, diffused glow of an English summer, but a searing, white-hot glare that hammered off the bleached earth of the parade ground and pressed against Eleanor's eyelids even through the blinds of her palanquin. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of frangipani and the underlying tang of dust, sweat, and unknown spices, was a presence in her lungs, heavy and foreign. It was a world away from the damp, green quiet of the Sussex Downs she had left behind, a world away from the life she had known. Eleanor Reed, now a widow of 6 months, felt the title like a leaden weight in her chest. Captain James Reed had been a name in her letters for 2 years, a handsome face in a daguerreotype. A man she had married in a whirlwind furlough and bid farewell to with the blushing optimism of a new bride. His death from a sudden fever, a terse, official letter had informed her, had left her not with the profound grief of a shared life, but with the hollow, aching void of a story untold. Adrift and penniless, her only option had been to take up the passage offered to military widows and journey to the place that had claimed him, to see the dust he had walked on. The palanquin lurched to a halt outside the residency bungalow in the small, strategically vital station of Jhera. Stepping out, her black crepe dress immediately absorbing the oppressive heat, she was met by a scene of ordered British life imposed upon a chaotic, vibrant land. Neat, whitewashed bungalows with deep verandas stood in defiance of the untamed jungle that pressed in on all sides. Sepoys in red coats marched with disciplined precision, while just beyond the cantonment fence, the local bazaar teemed with a cacophony of life, the cries of vendors, the bleating of goats, the jingle of bullock carts. "Mrs. Reed? I am Colonel Haversham." A tall, avuncular man with mutton chop whiskers and a kind, if somewhat weary, face approached her. "Welcome to Jhera. A dreadful business, your loss. James was a fine officer." Eleanor murmured her thanks, her eyes scanning the compound. And that was when she saw him. He stood near the stables, a contrast to the colonel's benign authority. Lieutenant Colonel Alistair Finch was a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as the land itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, his cavalry uniform, though immaculate, seemed to strain against the power of the frame beneath. His face was tanned to teak, a web of fine lines around his eyes etched by 1,000 suns. He wasn't handsome in the classical sense. His features were too harsh, his jaw too rigid, his mouth a firm, unsmiling line. He held a riding crop, slapping it rhythmically against his leather boot as he watched a young subaltern struggle to saddle a skittish mare. His gaze was sharp, critical, and utterly devoid of patience. "Finch," Haversham called. "Come and pay your respects to Mrs. Reed, Captain Reed's widow." Finch's head turned slowly. His eyes, a startlingly cold gray, swept over Eleanor, taking in her morning dress, her pale, travel-weary face, the slight tremble in her hands she tried so hard to hide. He walked over, his stride long and purposeful. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated with a lack of warmth. He did not offer condolences. "Lieutenant Colonel Finch commands the Bengal Light Cavalry here at Jhera," Haversham supplied, filling the uncomfortable silence. "A pleasure," Eleanor lied, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. "The pleasure is mine," Finch replied, the words a hollow formality. His eyes held hers for a moment too long. "Jhera is a challenging post for a newly arrived lady. I hope you find it to your liking." There was something in his tone, a subtle dismissal, that set her teeth on edge. "I did not come to Jhera for its likability, Colonel. I came to understand the place where my husband spent his final days." Finch's expression did not change, but a flicker in his eyes suggested he found this sentimentality foolish. "Understanding India is a lifetime's work, Mrs. Reed, and often a futile one. It is a land that tolerates us at best. We are here to maintain order, not to understand." The bluntness of his statement, so at odds with the colonial rhetoric of the civilizing mission, shocked her. Is that the sole purpose of the Raj? Order? Not justice? Not improvement? A faint, cynical smile touched his lips. "Improvement is a luxury afforded to stable lands. This is not stable. Order is the prerequisite for everything else. Without it, there is only chaos and bloodshed." He glanced at Haversham. "If you'll excuse me, Colonel." The new mounts from Arabia are proving temperamental." He gave a curt nod and strode away, the dust swirling around his boots. "Don't mind Finch," Haversham said, leading her towards the bungalow. "One of our best cavalry officers, but the years here have hardened him. He believes in the rule of the sword because, in his experience, it is the only thing the tribes and the local rajas truly respect." Eleanor entered the dim, cool interior of the bungalow, her mind churning. Alistair Finch was everything she despised: arrogant, cold, and utterly certain of his own rightness. He was the embodiment of the unfeeling imperialism she had begun to suspect festered at the heart of the empire. And as she stood in the home her husband had briefly occupied, a profound sense of isolation washed over her. She was alone, a speck of black in a sea of crimson and gold, surrounded by a man like Finch and a land that seemed to breathe a hostility as palpable as the heat. The days settled into a stifling routine. Eleanor attended church services, took tea with the other officers' wives, a circle of kind but insular women whose chief concerns were managing servants and the latest gossip from Calcutta, and tried to fill the empty hours with reading and letter writing. But the memory of her husband remained elusive here, in this place he had called home. The bungalow held no trace of his personality. It was a transient space, occupied by a succession of men who left nothing of themselves behind. Her inquiries about James were met with polite evasion. A good man, a tragic loss, did his duty. It was Finch's words, uttered during a chance encounter on the veranda after a week of sweltering stillness, that finally shed a sliver of light. "You persist in your quest, Mrs. Reed," he said, pausing as he passed by. He had been out on patrol, and the scent of horse leather and sun-baked earth clung to him. "He was my husband. Is it persistence or merely a wife's right?" Finch leaned against a veranda post, looking out at the gathering monsoon clouds. Captain Reed was an idealist. He believed in the proclamations from London, in the righteousness of our cause. He thought we could win hearts and minds with schools and irrigation canals. And you do not. "I believe a show of force prevents a river of blood. Your husband argued for leniency with the local zamindars, the landowners. He thought the new tax laws were unjust. He spent his time trying to mediate, to understand their grievances." Finch turned his gray eyes on her. It made him popular with the clerks and the interpreters, less so with his commanding officers, who saw it as a weakening of our position. Eleanor felt a surge of defensive pride. He believed in justice. "There is no justice here, Mrs. Reed. Only power. And your husband's justice would have led to a perception of weakness, which in these hills is an invitation for rebellion." He pushed himself off the post. His ideals did not save him from the fever, and they will not save you from the realities of Jhera. He left her then, his words hanging in the humid air like a threat. But for the first time, James felt real to her. He had been a man at odds with men like Finch, a man who saw the humanity in the faces the Colonel saw only as subjects or potential enemies. A fragile connection was forged in that moment, not with her husband's ghost, but with the principles he had held, and in direct opposition to the cynical philosophy of Alistair Finch. The tension between them became a fixed feature of the station's social landscape. At a regimental ball, held in the grand, if slightly shabby mess hall, it came to a head. Eleanor, wearing a gown of somber gray silk, had been conversing with a young Indian civil servant, Mr. Basu, an educated and softly spoken man who was discussing the potential for a new local school. "An admirable endeavor, Mr. Basu," Eleanor said, genuinely interested. "It is, Mrs. Reed. Though funding is, as always, a difficulty. The military budget takes precedence." It was then that Finch appeared at her elbow, a glass of brandy in his hand. "Bus, plotting the downfall of the empire with education again." Mr. Boss's smile was tight. "Merely its improvement, Colonel. The only improvement this region understands is a well-maintained rifle and a swift court-martial," Finch said, his tone deceptively light. "Schools won't stop a Pathan raid from the hills." Eleanor's temper, worn thin by heat and grief, snapped. "And rifles won't teach a child to read, Colonel. Perhaps if you spent less time on your parade ground and more time understanding the people you govern, you would not need to be so perpetually prepared for war. The small circle around them fell silent. To openly challenge a senior officer was social suicide. Finch's face grew still, his eyes narrowing to shards of ice. "I govern with the tools this land has given me, madam," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sentimentality is a poison. It clouds judgment. My duty is to protect every life in this cantonment, including yours, though you seem determined to make that task more difficult with your philanthropic fantasies." "My fantasies, as you call them, were my husband's convictions," she fired back, her voice trembling with fury. "A fact," Finch said, leaning slightly forward, "for which I am deeply and daily sorry." The insult was so profound, so deliberate, that Eleanor felt the breath leave her body. Without another word, she turned and walked away, the stares of the assembled officers and their wives burning into her back. The gulf between her and the hardened cavalry officer was now a chasm, filled with bitterness and a mutual, simmering contempt. The rebellion did not arrive with a single dramatic explosion, but like the monsoon, with a building tension that finally broke in a torrent of violence. The whispers had been there for weeks if one knew how to listen. A sullen look from a normally cheerful servant, averted gazes in the bazaar, a nervous energy that Mr. Basu had tried, obliquely, to warn the colonel about. Finch had dismissed it as baseless rumor. His intelligence, he declared, was sound. He was wrong. It began on a night when the air was so thick with moisture it was like breathing underwater. Eleanor was reading in her parlor when the first shot rang out, a sharp, alien crack that split the nocturnal chorus of insects. It was followed by another, and then a volley. Shouts, not in English, but in guttural Urdu and the local dialect, echoed from the perimeter. The crackle of musketry grew into a sustained roar, punctuated by the terrifying war cries of the rebels. The cantonment was under attack. Panic seized the bungalow. Her ayah screamed and cowered in a corner. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. Through the shuttered windows she could see the orange glow of fires blooming in the darkness. The world of teacups and social slights had vanished, replaced by primal, mortal terror. The door to her bungalow burst open. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted by the hellish glow outside, was Alistair Finch. His uniform was smudged with soot, a dark streak of blood on his cheek. In his hand he held a heavy cavalry pistol. "Reed. With me. Now." His voice was a whip crack, brooking no argument. "What is happening?" she managed to stammer. "The sepoys have turned. The militia from the hills has joined them. The outer perimeter is breached." He strode in, grabbing her arm. His grip was like iron. "We are falling back to the residency. It's the most defensible building. Move." He half dragged her out into the night. The air was acrid with smoke and gunpowder. Shadows ran and fought in the flickering light. She saw the body of a young British soldier lying near the gate. His red coat turned black in the moonlight. A scream lodged in her throat. They ran, ducking behind buildings as musket balls whizzed past. Finch moved with a lethal economy, his head constantly swiveling, his pistol firing twice with deadly accuracy at figures that lunged from the darkness. He was no longer the arrogant officer of the ballroom. He was a predator in his element, a man of brutal, efficient action. They reached the relative safety of the residency, a fortified stone building that was now a bastion of desperate defense. Haversham was there, his arm bandaged, directing men to the windows. The sounds of battle raged outside. The clash of steel, the screams of the dying. For 3 days they held out. The residency became their entire world, a microcosm of fear and dwindling hope. Ammunition was low, water was rationed, and the stench of blood and sweat was overwhelming. Through it all, Finch was everywhere, a pillar of grim resolve. He slept in brief, fitful bursts, his pistol never leaving his hand. Eleanor, shedding the helpless widow's role, found her own purpose. She organized the few other women and the wounded, tearing her petticoats for bandages, fetching water, holding the hand of a dying boy who reminded her of James. She worked tirelessly, her body aching, her mind numb to everything but the task at hand. It was during a lull in the fighting on the second night that she found herself next to Finch, who was cleaning his revolver by the light of a single, guttering lamp. His face was etched with a fatigue deeper than sleep could cure. "You are surprisingly capable, Mrs. Reed," he said without looking up. "And you are surprisingly human, Colonel," she replied, her voice hoarse. He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his exhausted eyes. "We do what we must to survive." "My husband, he wouldn't have known how to survive this," she said softly, the admission costing her something. Finch was silent for a long moment. "No, he wouldn't have. But his heart was in the right place. It was his methods I disagreed with, not his intent." He looked out at the barricaded window. Perhaps there is a place for both. The school and the sword. But not today. Today there is only the sword. It was the closest he had come to an apology, to an acknowledgement of her husband's worth. In the shared crucible of survival, the foundations of their animosity were beginning to crack. On the third day, the rebels massed for a final, overwhelming assault. It was clear the Residency could not hold. Their only hope was a desperate, breakout attempt to reach the river and commandeer boats to get to the safety of a larger garrison downstream. "We'll form a square," Finch explained to the haggard defenders. "The wounded and the women in the center. We cut our way through to the northern gate. It's our only chance." The plan was a death sentence and everyone knew it, but it was the only sentence left. As they burst from the Residency, the fighting descended into a nightmarish chaos of close-quarters combat. Eleanor, jostled in the center of the square, saw glimpses of hell. Finch, on foot now, his saber a flashing arc of steel, was a demon of battle. He fought with a cold, controlled fury, every movement precise and lethal. They were almost to the gate when a massive rebel, wielding a heavy tulwar, broke through the line and charged directly at Eleanor. Time seemed to slow. She saw the glint of the curved blade, the man's contorted face, the certain death rushing towards her. There was a blur of movement. Finch threw himself between her and the attacker. The tulwar meant for her skull bit deep into his shoulder. He grunted in pain, but his own saber never wavered, finding its mark in the rebel's throat. As the man fell, Finch staggered, his left arm hanging uselessly, blood soaking his uniform. "Finch!" Eleanor cried, rushing to support him. "Keep moving," he snarled, his face white with pain and shock. Somehow they made it to the river. Somehow, they fought their way onto two large barges and pushed off into the current, musket balls peppering the water around them. As the cannons of Jhera faded in the distance, a heavy silence fell over the survivors, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the steady splash of the oars. Eleanor tended to Finch's wound. It was deep and ugly. She cleaned it with the last of their clean water, and bandaged it with strips torn from her already ruined dress. He was leaning against the gunwale, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. "You saved my life," she said quietly. He opened his eyes. The cold gray was clouded with pain, but the hardness had softened. "It is my duty to protect the lives under my command." "This felt like more than duty," she whispered. He did not deny it. He just looked at her, and in that look, she saw the crumbling of his defenses, the acknowledgement of a connection forged in fire and blood. The arrogant colonel and the grieving widow were gone. In their place were just a man and a woman, stripped bare by adversity, clinging to life on a dark river in a hostile land. They reached the safety of the larger garrison at Allahabad. The rebellion in Jhera was eventually put down by a relief column, but the station was a shattered husk. The physical wounds healed slowly. Finch's shoulder would always carry a deep, roped scar, a permanent reminder of his choice on the battlefield. But it was the internal landscapes that had been most profoundly altered. The certainties that had defined them were gone. Eleanor no longer saw the world in the simple blacks and whites of idealism. She had looked into the face of chaos and understood the terrible, necessary price of order. And Finch, the hardened realist, had been forced to confront the value of the very humanity he had so often dismissed. He had seen courage not just in his soldiers, but in a widow's resilience, and he had made a choice that was personal, not just professional. Weeks later, as Finch prepared to return to a rebuilding Jhera, He found Eleanor walking in the gardens of the Allahabad residency. The fierce heat was giving way to the milder winter, and the air was sweet with the scent of roses. "I am returning to my post tomorrow," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I know. Haversham is not returning. He is taking a post in Calcutta. I am to be the new political agent for the region." He paused. "The methods will have to change. The heavy hand alone has failed. There must be building. There must be schools." Eleanor looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. James would have approved. "And you?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "What will you do? Return to England?" She looked out at the garden, at the vibrant, complicated, wounded land that had taken her husband and given her a new, painful, powerful understanding of life. It was a land of contradictions, of breathtaking beauty and unspeakable violence, and she was now irrevocably a part of it. "No," she said, turning to face him. Her gaze was clear, her voice steady. "There is work to be done here. Real work. And I find I am not done with Jhera yet." Alistair Finch, the man of stone and steel, looked at the woman who had challenged his every conviction and had, in saving his life as surely as he had saved hers, remade them. He did not smile. It was not in his nature, but his eyes, those cold gray eyes, held a warmth she had never seen before. "Then perhaps, Mrs. Reed," he said, offering her his arm, "we might begin again." She took it, her hand resting lightly on the wool of his uniform, over the scar that bound them together. The past was a ghost, the future an unwritten page. But on the crimson earth of Jhera, amidst the ruins and the hope, a new and unexpected story was waiting to begin.